Hey there, students, and welcome back to the next segment of my series on the French Revolution, which is going to focus on the radicalization of the French Revolution, essentially moving from the liberal phase of 1789 to 1791 into this more radical phase that's going to include the Reign of Terror. In other words, how did this revolution get from the 1791-1789 revolution that was really more along lines of John Locke and maybe trying to replicate the British system until 1793, where you've got more of a full-on Rousseau kind of thing going on here, where there is this attempt to create a radical democracy, a dictatorship of the people. So that's what this is about, and this goes out to my great friends at Quartz Hill High School in California. Wow, Jen, Morgan, Isaac, Nikki, your whole class. Y'all are awesome. Keep it up. So first of all, let's review the liberal phase. You go from the dominant class being the bourgeoisie, the goals really being that of a constitutional monarchy, liberal reform, and the abolition of privilege. Your primary influencers being Locke and Montesquieu, really your more temperate and in a lot of ways more sane kind of Enlightenment era philosophers. And the governing bodies during the liberal phase were the National Assembly and the Legislative Assembly. Now moving on to the radical phase, where you're going to see the rise of the Jacobins and the sans-culottes, the goals being more along the lines of egalitarianism, nationalism, cheap bread. The influencers, really Rousseau, and especially his idea of the general will, is going to be a big influencer during this radical phase. And the governing bodies during the radical phase being the National Convention and the Committee on Public Safety. Now, the thing is, what we're doing here is we're going to see how did this revolution move from liberal to radical. And then in the next segment, I'm going to discuss the Reign of Terror in detail. So it starts with the Chapelier law. I'm sure I pronounced that wrong, but it's a written test. Remember that if anybody's watching in France. I'm sorry. Je suis sorry, or however you would say that. So in 1791, a lot of times I refer to the Chapelier law as the last stand of the liberals. As far as what this was, this forbade guilds, workers' combinations, labor unions, and strikes. And this was really the last vestige of the classical liberalism that we saw in the very early part of the French Revolution. And I've got some other videos on classical liberalism if you want to know more about that. And so the goal here of the Chapelier law was to reduce the influence of the urban masses, that the liberals believed that if this revolution is about liberty and equality and property rights and that sort of thing, that what we're really looking at here is if you let the masses in, they're going to have a different view of what liberty and equality and all of that kind of stuff mean. And so you've got to temper their influence. And so eventually the crowd would gain control and it would get really ugly, just as the liberals feared. So the key events of 1791, in June, you've got the Chapelier law, then the flight to Varennes. Then in August, the declaration of Pillnitz. In September, the proclamation of the French kingdom. And then in October, that the Legislative Assembly convenes. So first of all, looking at our friend Louis XVI. I want to be a constitutional monarch. Said no king ever. Every king thinks in terms of, I want to be powerful and all of that kind of stuff. Now, that's not Louis. I mean, you look at this artistic rendition of Louis, sad. All right, sad. Now, you see here that Louis is depicted wearing a liberty cap and a revolutionary tricolor cockade, and both of these depict him as powerless. You see him drinking out of a bottle, and it says, Viva la Nación, or the nation. I probably said that more in Spanish. Gosh, written test. Now, the flight to Varennes, that Louis really doesn't like that this revolution has created a government in France that is largely beyond his control. So Louis and his family attempted to flee Paris and to attempt to escape to Montmedy. Now, this was somewhere that was a fortress on the border, on the French frontier, and it's pretty awesome. Like, if you look at this aerial map here, you can see a plateau and all kinds of cool fortifications and all of that stuff. This was a citadel. I mean, this was something that was, you know, the royalist military officers were going to meet him there, and from there, from that position of strength, they could plot a counter-revolution. But Louis was caught, all right? When you're the king, people kind of know what you look like, all right? So dressing up as some sort of fake bourgeois family, not good. And so he's caught. They basically recognized him from a note of paper money or something like that. And so basically Louis makes a not so triumphant return to Paris, escorted by the National Guard. This isn't like long live the king sort of thing. This is like the king tried to escape and we got him. So the way Louis is being treated here starts to worry members of the aristocracy on the continent. And in 1791, Prussia and Austria issued the Declaration of Pillnitz. Now, the Declaration of Pillnitz said that if Louis XVI is threatened, if his person is threatened, his kingship, that they would declare war on France. Now, Austria said that they're going to go in if all of the great powers go to war, but Prussia's basically like, look, we're in this no matter what. So if something happens to Louis, France is going to be at war. And so one thing that the French did to Louis is they didn't necessarily fire him, but they demoted him. Louis had been crowned the King of France, but the French people decide, well, Louis, from now on, you are King of the French. You are not King of France, the king of the nation, someone who gets your divine right from God. You are the king of the French. You are the king of the French people. You get your power not from above, but from below. And what the people give, the people can also take away. So at this time, the National Assembly, which had been the primary legislative body of France ever since the failure of the Estates General, the National Assembly dissolved itself, and a legislative assembly was elected by universal manhood suffrage. That's right. Every man could vote, regardless of whether he owned property or anything like that. And furthermore, not only did they expand the electorate far beyond what had ever happened, those who had served in the National Assembly would be ineligible. So you think about a situation where you let just anybody vote, and the people who have experience in government and the most respected members of the community who'd been part of the National Assembly, they're done. Now, it sounds like a very noble sort of thing, but there are a lot of pitfalls here, and of course that's sort of what happens. So at this point, we start to see things move more into this radical phase. You see this in the Jacobin clubs. Now, the Jacobins were a radical political faction. Now, it's often used, the term Jacobin is typically used to describe the Montagnards, the mountain, which was the most radical group that met in the Jacobin clubs, but there were also the Girondins, who were less radical. Now, what the Jacobins all had in common was this idea of republicanism. Now, of course, in a republic, that is a government where the government's power comes from the people. And furthermore, when you have a republic, you don't have a king. The Romans, when they created their republic, they ran out the king. And so monarchy and republicanism are not compatible. That the idea of a constitutional monarchy is something that's losing currency. Even this idea of Louis as King of the French is not something that sits well with the people in these Jacobin clubs, which really starts off as kind of harmless debating societies, but they really get involved in politics as time goes on. And so here is the composition of the Legislative Assembly, where you still had several constitutional monarchists who made up the right wing. Now, the French Revolution is where we get the left-wing, right-wing dichotomy that often seems to fail us in modern political discussions, because, in the United States today, you had left-wing populism and right-wing populism in our 2016 election. But for the French at this time, the right wing, these are the more traditional folks, and then the left wing, these are the people who are more radical. And of course, you had the moderates, the plain. And so this was what you're looking at in 1791 and 1792. And then a new group of people, when I mentioned the Chapelier law, which was designed to limit the influence of the masses. Well, here are the masses, the sans-culottes, without breeches. Now, by without breeches, basically without the knee breeches, okay? These were people who wore actual pants. So sans-culottes, or sans-culotte, or however you'd say that in French, these are people who don't wear the aristocratic look. You think about, like, the Marquis de Lafayette and Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, they wore those breeches around, that was fashionable. But the sans-culottes, this is the urban working class. And so you see here, if you were a part of the working class, you wore long pants. Whereas if you wanted a more aristocratic look, then you would wear these knee breeches, pantyhose, and all of that kind of stuff. Okay, these people don't have time for pantyhose. They're the sans-culottes. They are the urban working class, and they are going to become most prominent during this period, and they became a very decisive force in the radicalizing of the French Revolution. And so as far as 1792, the French Revolutionary Wars begin in April. Now, of course, you've got to keep in mind that the rest of this whole saga is going to unfold with a backdrop of war. Now, of course, when there's war, there's panic. The government seizes powers that it normally would not seize. And so just remember that that's going on behind the scenes with everything we're going to go through for the next several years of the French Revolution. And in September, you have the September Massacres, followed by the proclamation of the French Republic. Then the National Convention convenes, and finally in December, we've got the trial of Louis XVI. So the French Revolutionary Wars, which lasted from 1792 to 1802, brief break before the Napoleonic Wars after 1802, and throughout the chaos that follows, France is at war with several nations at once, not just with one country, but with a whole coalition of enemies. Now, the Duke of Brunswick was leading the army that was trying to restore Louis to power. And so the Duke of Brunswick issued the Brunswick Manifesto, which said that Louis will be restored to power, and those who resist will be treated as rebels. Now, a lot of people in France weren't too crazy about this foreign guy that was coming in and telling them how it was going to be. I have blurred out a certain part of this picture, so you don't necessarily see what this person's doing with the Brunswick Manifesto, but if you use your imagination, you can probably guess. And so as far as these wars that are going on, it's very important that we think in terms of, we've discussed in another lecture, the Prussian armies, which were smaller by comparison, but very, very disciplined. And so when you look at the coalition armies, they're really operating on the Prussian model. Smaller forces, very well trained and experienced professionals. Now, on the other hand, you've got the French armies, which were larger forces made up of a combination of conscripts and volunteers, and very patriotic for the most part. So you have these smaller, more disciplined armies that are going against this more, this larger, more patriotic and, nationalistic army. So both sides have various advantages that come along with that. And now the September Massacres, when the Duke of Brunswick is bringing his army in, then, well, what if he gets to Paris? What's going to happen? And there were lots of people in jail, lots of political prisoners, lots of enemies of the revolution. And what's going to happen if the Duke of Brunswick comes in and lets all these people out of prison? Well, they're just going to join him. So what do? Well, we'll just kill them. And so that's what they do. They just kill them. And, take all the prisoners out and just execute them. So it's kind of foreshadowing what's going to come. And then On the 22nd of September 1792, you have the proclamation of the French Republic. And we see all kinds of Republican symbolism here on this unit of currency. You see a fasces. You also see the French Republican cap. You see this eagle. Lots of things to make this place look like ancient Rome. If you want to see the Liberty Cap and the fasces, look no further than the seal of the United States Senate, which has the same sort of Republican symbolism here. Of course, we're talking about small r republicanism, the philosophy of government, not the party. So Louis is now deposed. There's no king in a republic. This isn't, everybody's a winner sort of thing, okay? It's like, Louis, you are not the king of France anymore. You are now citizen Louis Capet. And so as a citizen, he's just like everyone else. And in fact, this is something that people are starting to call each other. So instead of calling each other by aristocratic titles, you would simply call someone citizen. So I would be Citizen Richey, or something like that. I guess you'd call me Citizen Tom if you wanted to be even more casual about it. So at this time, we see a new legislative body, the National Convention. And this is where we see that the French Revolution is going to go full-on radical. Now, if we look at the composition of the National Convention, you see that it is dominated by the Jacobin factions, the less radical Girondins, and the more radical Montagnards, the mountain, the people who sat in the high seats. You know, think about like a gymnasium or something like that. These people were called the mountain because they sat in the highest seats, kind of in the bleachers. And then you have the plain, the people who were in the middle. And so what's going to happen here, and we're going to see this over and over again, is that we're going to see different factions come together and pull apart and pull each other apart, really, is what you're going to see here. So the trial of Louis XVI occurred at the turn of 1792 to 1793, and he was charged with treason. 33 different charges were brought against the king. And so when you look at these Republican factions that had previously advocated republicanism, the thing is, it's a question of who's going to go farther. And so the mountain, they want to execute the king. The Girondins believed in a republic, but they didn't want to execute the king. Now, of course, after Louis gets executed, then the Girondins are now the enemy because, hey, they wanted to spare the guy. So Louis XVI is executed in January of 1793. Quite a picture there. Look at that head. It's like, wow! It's just like, oh my goodness. I mean, just head cut off on that guillotine. All right, and this is something new that we're seeing here, that the guillotine, now this is something that looks kind of fearsome to us or something like that, but really, the guillotine it's a pretty quick death. All right, it's one of those things that it makes death less painful, and it also equalizes death, because under the old regime, a nobleman would be executed by beheading. That was the nobleman's privilege, whereas someone who was not a nobleman would be executed by hanging. Well, now everyone is going to be executed by the guillotine, and it's gonna cut your head off every time. It's not like if you leave the headsman a bad tip and he accidentally hits your shoulder the first time and like, ow! Oops, that sort of thing. The guillotine, it's going to work every time, all right? So this, not just 60% of the time, but it works every time. And so this is something that gives the French people equality in death. And so in a lot of ways, it was supposed to be something that was benevolent and equalizing and all of that great stuff. But, we think about it, it's like, oh my goodness, so many heads coming off, because it is a very efficient instrument. Now let's take a look at the symbolism of the French Republic. We see, first of all, again, Republican symbolism, the Liberty Cap, the cockade, and then a tricolor flag. Now, the national motto here of the Republic: Liberté, Equalité, Fraternité, au la mort. Liberty, equality, fraternity, or death. Now, the last one you don't always hear. I think they kind of stopped using that later because, it's like it kind of scares people. But it's basically like, look, liberty, we're all free. Equality, we're all equal. Fraternity, we're all friends here. And if you don't like it, you can die. All right. Got a guillotine right there. We got a basket to put your head in and all of that kind of stuff. So, be free, be equal, be friends, or we're going to kill you. So, next up is going to be the Reign of Terror. That's when it's going to get really messy. So, stay tuned for that. Of course, subscribe if you haven't already. TomRichey.net. Social media, Twitter, Instagram, all of that kind of stuff. Snapchat, whatever. I'll be back soon. And it's always a pleasure.